Dr. Jen Nyland. She's from the biology department, and she's going to do her talk on, it's not up here, the title of her talk, which I've forgotten.
It was something clever about water.
Yeah, it was. I should have talked to us about water, well water, drinking water. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Close the back door.
All right. So before we get started, if you would, this is my first mentee, so forgive me for those of you who use this all the time. But private survey, right? I'm just trying to get a pulse of the room. How many of you don't know where your water comes from? Know that your household is on a private well to give you your water? If you are on city water, right, municipal services, or if all of your drinking water is bottled. Whatever, nobody's judging, right? So just pick whatever answer best represents what you know or don't know. How many people do we have in the room? 2, 4. Yeah. Some people are on top of it and we're already doing it. That's awesome. I think we're pretty close. You can, if the QR code isn't working for you, you can use menti.com and then that code that's up at the top. Okay. Everybody had a chance to answer who wanted to answer? Not yet? Okay. Menti.com. 8506-7603 is the code to enter. Right. Yep. Everybody else got their entries in? Students signed in? Cool. All right, so keep this graph in the back of your mind. What's in my water and where does it come from? That was the title. Super clever, right? So I wanted to, a couple of caveats. So I am a professor in the biological sciences department. I am by training an immunologist and a toxicologist, so I think about, in my research, the intersection between what you might be exposed to in the environment and impacts to health. Usually I'm thinking about human health, but we certainly are exploring in the lab through some new partnerships, effects of those exposures on the environment, ecosystems, non-human organisms. Okay. But I also want to tell you that I serve on the Wicomico Environmental Trust Board, and this organization is about putting science first in decision making with respect to the environment. And I'm particularly interested in the impacts to water. And so as part of that partnership, I help to direct the laboratory analyses for creek watchers for the Wicomico River. So we have some volunteers here in the room who every month or twice a month from March to November go out onto the Wicomico River and sample for us, and those citizen scientists bring us back samples of that river water that we test in the lab, and then we report that out in an annual report to the city, to the county, to residents, and all of that is made possible because of the Wicomico Environmental Trust. So I want you to keep that in mind, right? I'm not coming from an unbiased opinion here. So that's important to think about as you're listening to me talk. So do you know where your water comes from? So we did that Menti because frequently folks don't. Either you just turn on the tap or push the thing on the fridge or use the water fountains, and you don't know where ultimately that water came from, right? For the city of Salisbury, most of our residents are on a municipal system. If you're in Fruitland, you're on a different municipal water supply system, but it is sorted through a whole bunch of different processes before it gets to you. So there's regulations in place that help to protect that water before it gets into your glass, right? But if you're on a private well, depending on where you live and the depth of that well and when it was installed and what you are doing to maintain it, the quality of that water could be very different. And so we're going to talk about the differences in those regulations and the potential exposures from that. Some people, because they don't know where the water's coming from, they're not really sure, and they don't know how it's been treated or filtered or how they're protected, are like, I'm going to drink bottled water. This is my mechanism. Some folks, that's the only recourse they have, because even the municipal water, anybody heard of Flint, Michigan? Right? Also, Baltimore, DC, right? This is not just Flint. Closer to home, there have been significant problems with municipal water sources that have introduced toxic agents, adverse health affecting agents into the drinking water, into the water supply, right? So some of those folks have to then find other sources, and it can be costly. But let me tell you, bottled water isn't all the same. It's not all regulated the same. And there are some things that are in that plastic water bottle that might not be what you would want to be consuming all the time. So I'm not a geologist. I told you I'm a biologist, I'm an immunologist, and a toxicologist. So I tried to brush up on some stuff from like a million years ago when I was an undergrad and I had to take this kind of course, right? So groundwater, right? So we're not usually like siphoning off water from the surface water that's out there. So we usually don't have big pumps going into like the Wicomico River, pumping out the water, right? There are some places where that happens. For example, one of my favorite vacation spots in central New York is one of the Finger Lakes, Skaneateles, New York. And Skaneateles Lake is fantastic. It's one of these glacier plunge like Finger Lakes. It was caused by the glaciers receding. It's super deep, really clean water. And so if you have a house that's on that fairly remote area, you don't usually have a well drilled straight down. Instead, you have like a kind of underground, but not really, line that goes out to a pump sitting in the lake, and it pumps that water straight out. So this is water that is just out there, right? Fish are doing all their business in it. All kinds of weird stuff is happening, right? So whatever's in the water right there on the surface is going to come into your water supply unless you do something about it. So what we're talking about here, though, is groundwater. So city systems typically will pull out of some groundwater source. The same wells, for sure, are pulling out of a groundwater source. But you'll notice from this figure that there are a couple of different locations where that water could come from. So you see that there's an unconfined aquifer at the top, that top blue band. And then there's a confined aquifer. All that means is it takes a lot longer for something that's out in the environment, applied on land, in the air, coming through rainwater, to get into the confined aquifer than it takes for it to get into the unconfined aquifer. But there is still some protection. This unconfined aquifer is not surface water. It's not a river, it's not a lake. There is a protective barrier, okay? So the confining unit, clay, something that's less porous than sand, right? Some way to help keep these two bodies of water separate and to minimize the movement of solutes from up in the environment into the confined aquifer, right? So if you were to drill a well, right, down into the ground, let's say on the left-hand side of those trees that are there, right? Which water supply would you want to go into for your water, for your drinking water? Unconfined or confined? Ginny? Why?
Because you said it's harder for the external solutes to get in there, and I don't know what the external solutes are, but I probably don't want to drink them.
Okay, so Ginny's thinking, I don't want to be exposed to whatever it is that's out there that people, animals, things are doing in the environment that could be getting into the surface water, let alone into this unconfined aquifer, so I'm going to go as deep as I can. So I'm going to go into the confined aquifer because it takes a lot longer for whatever's out there to work its way into that system, right? 100 years, 1,000 years, much longer for it to work its way down, as opposed to months or years into the unconfined aquifer, or even less than that for surface water, right? Okay. Is everybody okay with that? Like, is that what you would think? Well,
It actually matters. There's so many things we don't know yet. How many other wells are there? How many different water quality samples have been taken? If you drill into the confined aquifer and it's already toxic, you're screwed because you don't have hydrologic access to the unconfined aquifer.
exactly. So the assumption is that the confined aquifer, because it's like protected with that barrier, is going to be cleaner and purer. And so we definitely want to go there. But all I told you was that we're minimizing impacts from the top down into it. But that doesn't mean that, what about the rock underneath it? What about the source of, there could be something, some big well that was drilled down that's like released a whole bunch of baloney into there, right? So yes, we need to know something about those before we make a general decision about where we want to get that water from, right? Okay. So let me just tell you that the Salisbury aquifer is, it's called the paleo channel. I just learned this word, so it's very exciting. But it is an unconfined aquifer. It sits fairly close to the surface. The Wicomico aquifer is the shallowest confined aquifer around. So on the eastern shore, on the Delmarva, we have mostly, so not like super, super deep aquifers that we have access to. I was trying to look at all these USGS maps. It was kind of crazy. And we have some other folks who probably can answer some questions for us. But how do we know what's in the water? We have to measure it, right? We have to sample the water as we are able to be able to tell. So we have things like, so here's all the different, or some of the different Wicomico County groundwater monitoring wells that are available. Right? So you can go, these are publicly available data. You can go and you can find out where they are. You can get graphs, beautiful graphs of how deep the water was at different times, and is this well no longer working, and sometimes some of the data. Right? So there is a system in place to sample the different aquifers, hopefully, to tell us what might be in there. But do you think that they're measuring everything all the time? Right? No. It takes time, it takes money to sample and analyze, and you can only analyze for so many things. Right? So if you're on a municipal water system, usually you get a report every year, right, that has, here's what we found. And hopefully everything's like, it's all below detection limits, which is good. There are some things that detection limit is kind of high, and there might be some health effects if you are exposed below that limit, but it's good if it's at least not detectable, right? And there's some things that they'll say, well, we found it, but all of the levels were below this regulatory limit, right? So that's good. Again, usually, depending on who has set that limit, you have some reasonable confidence that that level of exposure is unlikely to cause significant adverse health effects. Except there are at-risk populations, there are vulnerable populations. So if you are a pregnant female presenting person and you have that developing fetus, during gestation, during that time, depending on what it is, the exposure to the fetus could have very different health impacts than the adult exposure. And depending on what the exposure is, the patterns of those adverse effects can be very, very different, right? So, for example, I study mercury. This is one of the things I study. And human adults, if you ingest it, a certain percentage will get across into your blood. But your blood-brain barrier is well developed. You have a lot of proteins that are available to help remove that and metabolize the form that you're exposed so that it's less toxic, right? But if you're pregnant and you're exposed to that, the fetus, the fetal compartment where it's developing, actually, so it can move across the placenta, and the fetus actually sucks it up like a sponge. So the fetal compartment is concentrating the mercury exposure. So in Minamata, Japan, when there was a huge incident, the mothers actually were protected because they were pregnant. The children were born with severe adverse effects, things like cerebral palsy, deformities, like all kinds of horrible things. But the moms did not have all the neurological impacts. They weren't poisoned. So developmental window, exposure, all of that stuff matters depending on what we're talking about. So we're not studying everything, we're not measuring anything, and we can't really predict for every single person out there, every single organism out there, your dog, your cat, right, drinking the water, what the exposure will lead to potentially. So we monitor as best we can based on what we know. One of the things that we monitor for, and this is also part of our Creek Watchers program, is we look for nitrate. Does anybody know what nitrate is? Other than it sounds like it's probably a chemical. Chemist, biologist, no? What if I tell you, so nitrate is like nitrogen with some oxygens on it. Okay. Do you have any clue where you might get that nitrogen? Okay, we're going to come back to it. So the EPA has set a limit of exposure of 10 parts per million. It's just a concentration that we can use for water, air, things like this. But in this case, it's water. So they want the exposure level to be below 10 if we can get it there, right? What this is showing you, and it's a little bit hard to see with these lights on, hopefully you can appreciate that there are red and yellow dots, right? So the yellow dots are more locations where it was more than 8 parts per million was the measured value at some point during, I feel like this was 2008 to 2014 in Wicomico County. I think that's where these data are coming from. And the red dots are above that limit of 10 parts per million. Where do you live? How close are you? And what do you think about this distribution of red and yellow dots on here?
And you're talking about this was in the aquifer or this in?
The monitoring wells, yeah.
Just a little above 10 or like 100 times?
Right? We don't know scale. So above 8 but less than 10 is the yellow ones. So we're less than the limit that the EPA has set, but it's detectable. Okay. Or red, more than 10, up to infinity. Like I don't know, right? We have no idea what that measure is. But what do you think about the distribution of it? Let me ask you this. Do you think they sampled all at the same time? Every single well? Do you think that these are averages of samples across like an entire multi-year period? So repeated measures. Every month we go out and we get a sample. Seems unlikely, right? Because a lot of work, kind of expensive, right? It's a lot. So even if you were like, well, okay, I'm all right because I'm in the middle of that yellow cluster in the middle. What if it's only one sample? And what if that was from 2008 and then all the red ones around it are from 2014 and they didn't sample again? Oh, I don't know, right? Yeah. That seems scary. Okay, that's just nitrate. We haven't even talked about where it comes from or what it can do. All right, so where does it come from? So the Salisbury Aquifer, the paleo channel, right? It's really very close below the surface, and that like protective barrier above it that makes it different from being surface water is really sandy. Do you think sandy soil is a better barrier or a worse barrier? than like hard clay. Right? Worse. Stuff trickles through that really quickly, drains. It's fantastic if you plant something that needs well-drained soil. You got it, right? But if you want to keep what's on the top out of that, it's not got very far to go and it's kind of easy to get through. Maybe. There are some caveats to that, right? There are some things that stick to silica pretty easily, or they stick to the organic things that are in there, or it like does end up getting filtered out. So I don't want to make it all doom and gloom, right? But if we had a thicker, deeper, maybe different composition barrier at the top, we might be a little bit more protected. Just here, right? We're not talking about anything else. But so that means that anything that's on the surface has the potential, an easier time getting through to that aquifer that we're using, right? So land use matters. What we're doing, not just right next to the rivers, the surface water, but what we're doing all over in this watershed matters. Ultimately, there is some connection there, right? And so agricultural land use, what kinds of compounds and chemicals you put in your garden, on your grass, right? All of that matters because it has the potential to get in to that aquifer. And so nitrates, we're going to come back to that. Why do you think I'm talking about nitrogen-containing compounds and also talking about agriculture and landscaping? Yes?
Fertilizer.
Exactly. Fertilizer. And what if I also tell you that things like chicken poop is really high in nitrogen? What happens here on the Eastern Shore? I mean, I am contributing to that problem because I do have 4 chickens in my backyard. But I'm very careful with what I do with their waste. Right? But
You started your water ponds, it's just a drop in the bucket compared to your chicken empire.
my 4 little chickens. 2, Nessie, not Nessie, Goldie and the bear. Don't ask me why the name. So agriculture, whether it is the chicken industry or what we do with the waste that's coming out of those houses, right? And so one of the things that happens here frequently is you have agricultural fields that need fertilizer. If fertilizer has nitrogen in it and the chicken poop has nitrogen in it, it's right there. Just like pull it off and spray it on there, right? Yeah. I mean, it comes with other stuff too. So agriculture as it's in like broadly speaking, right? So not just the chicken farms, not just other agricultural land, but growing fields and things like, if we're putting any kind of fertilizer on there, you have the potential not just to have it to wash off in a big rainstorm into the river, but to also make its way down into the aquifer, especially here on the Eastern Shore where we have such a shallow, unconfined aquifer. So what do you do about it? If you are on city water, you get that report annually, right? How often do you think that they're testing their water? Like the city of Salisbury? No more often than they have to. There's regulations, there's rules in place that say for a municipal water source that there's certain things they have to test for, right? And there's a certain periodicities, like so how frequently do you have to do it?
You have to test every 7 days or something.
It depends on what it is, but yeah. But even if they are testing every week, when do you get the report? Once a year. So in February of last year, there was a spike in the nitrogen level and the nitrate level in your water. Sorry. Right? Right? You drank it already. It's too late. But they are doing their due diligence because there are regulations in place. At least with that system, you have some protections. Now, for those of you who said you're on private wells, how often do you test your water? Because you got to test it. Nobody else is coming to your house and pulling a sample from your spigot and running it through all of the same tests that the city of Salisbury or Fruitland is doing, right? I spent only a small amount of time trying to read these legal documents on a bunch of different websites because I don't have that kind of brain. But in many situations, if you're putting in a new well, you have to test it. If you're buying a house though, and the well is already there, you don't have to test it. You should, but you don't have to. Right? So the wells, there's like old construction wells where there could be gaps and how that sucker was put in there, and so there's all kinds of stuff that could be getting in. Plus, not to mention what's in the water, right? So you probably should test private well water frequently. I mean, I wouldn't do it every week, but I think reasonably, certainly, to have some idea of what's happening. But tests are kind of, I mean, $50 a test, so it's kind of expensive. That's just for nitrate. But you can treat your water if you don't have the funds to test very frequently. You could put in a water treatment system. So there's different methods. There's with varying degrees of expense, right? That can allow you to like reverse osmosis, different things like this to try to pull out the things that would be bad for you to be exposed to. But almost all of those have some fail point, right? So either the concentration is too high or the system is too old or you've overloaded it, right? So, and they can be very expensive to input and to like install and then to maintain. So depending on where you are on the socioeconomic ladder, right? You might not have the means to put in that, and your house just happens to be in a place where you're on a well, right? You're not part of the city. So there's certainly an equity piece of this, right? The more, the folks with a little bit more means might be able to ensure that their water is a little bit safer than those who don't have as many means. So what are the risks of exposure? So we know some things because of toxicology studies, because of epidemiologic studies, studies in humans, free-range humans usually. So things like high-dose exposure to nitrates. Again, depending on the developmental stage, right? So high-dose exposure through ingestion, so drinking water exposure, potentially can lead to something called blue baby syndrome. So it's about oxygen exchange in the fetus, right? It's bad, and we want to try and minimize that. Wicomico County doesn't have, at least as far as I could find, any reports of that happening. So that would say, okay, well, the nitrates must not be that bad. Those red dots maybe aren't that bad, right? But that's a very limited exposure window to a vulnerable population, right? So what about long-term chronic exposure at a low dose? Could it accumulate? So short-term low-dose exposure, toxicologically, we might not be that concerned about it, but a longer-term chronic low-dose exposure, that's very different than a single high-dose exposure, right? So we have to do a different kind of study to be able to tell the difference in a high-dose, short-term exposure during a particular developmental window compared to low-dose, chronic exposure in adults, for example.
Are you talking about exposure to any toxin or specifically nitrates still? I mean, obviously, we would test for any, but...
The blue baby syndrome is nitrates.
Okay.
And the difference in exposure, time frame, and dose usually matters for most things. More recently, there's been a decent number of publications in the scholarly research that are linking nitrate exposure to different types of cancer. So these are just some of the reviews that are like looking at a lot. So these are systematic reviews. They look at lots and lots of peer-reviewed publications, and then from all of those, so they're looking at each individual peer-reviewed publication and they're kind of scoring it based on how well the science was done, how big the human population is, if it's a human study, usually it is, that we're looking at, right? Or is it only, well, we only looked at female college students between the ages of 18 and 21 and only the white ones, right? That's a very limited study compared to, we looked at 57,000 of folks in this urban area. And we tried to catch as many different age range, like ages and ethnicities and all of that stuff, right? So these studies the systematic review ones are holding the literature to a different standard because they're saying we're only going to count, hopefully if they did it right, we're only going to count the studies that met a certain criteria, right? And then they draw conclusions. So there's actually a growing body of literature, 2018, 2022, I think 23, that says that there might be a link. Might be a link. If you really delve into these, it's the way that the like numbers that they use to analyze these, it's slightly more possible, but it's not like definite causation, right? So we're tipping the scale in the direction to say we think this might be happening, but we need more studies. We need more data. We need to be really careful about how we're designing our studies so we're catching as many of those different variables that could impact the outcomes that we're looking at. But nitrates aren't all that's in the water. Just as some examples, for a long time, the chicken industry was using roxarsone, which is an arsenic-containing compound, and said they were using it as a growth promoter. We did some studies here on the Eastern Shore when I was a postdoctoral fellow at Hopkins at the School of Public Health, and we came out here and we were able to, like, with Hopkins branded gear, so nobody, like, they understood that we were actually legit, like we had our clipboards and everything. And we went up to folks and we were like, I know, like a clipboard
Scientists.
I mean, seriously, it was like white polo shirt with a Hopkins brand and a clipboard. Like, hi, I'm from Hopkins School of Public Health. We would like to test your water. Here's a bottle. And we had this whole procedure. We asked them a bunch of questions. And if it was from a well, we got from the tap as well as got the wellhead number so we could get some information on it. And it was like a random sampling across the entire Eastern Shore of Maryland. It was based on the like zip coding, and it was like, I don't know, this epidemiologist friend of mine designed the whole thing. All I did was like, okay, I'm going to what address? And then if there's nobody home, you go down to the next one and the next one until you finally catch somebody. And then you record GPS where that was, right? So why is that study not up here? The graduate student who was working on that for her dissertation found some very interesting things about arsenic in the water here on the Eastern Shore. And then she got a job and she published her dissertation and in like the repository, right? So it didn't go out into a scientific journal. It just sort of went into the library, but there's an electronic version of it theoretically someplace, right? And then she got a job at the EPA when she graduated. And we're like, oh, cool, you're gonna publish that now. And she was like, I don't know, that's a political job. I am worried about my future if I publish this thing that says we need to worry about it. So y'all, I just went and looked for that. And it took me 45 minutes. I knew who the author was, I knew the title of it, and I knew when it was published. It took me 45 minutes to find it. I couldn't get it. I went on interlibrary loan and said I want it. They said you can't have it. It's not physically available. Maybe if I walked my booty over to Hopkins and went into the archives, I might be able to get it. Or they were like, you can call your friend and see if she'll give you an electronic copy of what she has. So that study has disappeared.
So what did it find?
That's why I wanted to go back and look at it, because I can't remember. I know that there were relationships, the arsenic levels. So we geomapped land use. So was there a soybean field? Was there a CAFO in close proximity? Was it a well or was it city water? And then we measured arsenic levels in the water. And this was just before the industry made the change to get rid of Rogerstone. So my recollection of it is that there was a relationship between the land use and wells, but not city water. But don't quote me on that because I couldn't find that. I mean, I guess I could go to Hopkins. If I had remembered I was giving this talk more than a week ago, I would have gone to Hopkins and gotten it, but I forgot. Okay, so lots of things can get in. So this is one example of use of a compound. Ooh, which by the way, the chicken industry wrote us a really nice letter and said, it's not like arsenic is a poison. It's the definition of a poison. You look it up in Webster's. Here's an example, arsenic. Apparently not. It's a fantastic show. So other organic compounds could also be in there. And I put up TCE, trichloroethylene, because this was a study that was published, or results that were published by the Wicomico County Health Department in Advancement of the Science some time ago, but it was because there was contamination of the groundwater, Morris Mill community, with TCE. Does anybody know what happened with that? Do you need me to do this thing? Okay. So TCE is an organic compound. It's bad. Yes.
Water supply.
Right. So, if you have contamination in the aquifer, there's only a handful of things you can do. Like you can pump out all the water and treat it and put it back. So pump and treat is something that engineers will talk about being able to do. And then you have to keep monitoring it, right? But it's sometimes a little bit easier to just take people off the well and connect them to the municipal water system. So that's what we did. So I'm in Fruitland and I have city water now. Yay. PFAS is something that's been in the news a lot in this area. Is it in the rivers? Yes. Is it something we should be concerned about? Probably. Do we know enough about it? No. So many of these compounds are currently, like the NIH, EPA, these kinds of folks are providing grants to researchers to try and figure out what's going on with these compounds, and in particular to, depending on the agency, like women and children, infants, adults, right? They're trying to look at chronic exposure, low dose exposure, high dose exposure. BPA is the perfect example of that. I was talking about the water bottles. We used to think that BPA at high levels was really the problem. But it turns out that at really low doses, and this like blew people's mind, at really low doses it does something totally different. And it is much more dangerous adverse effects at low doses, and in particular to young kids. So, and we didn't really know that until we started looking at the low dose range. Lead, we've never been able to find what the lowest no adverse effect level is. Doesn't matter how low you go. You go as low as you can measure, you can still find something bad happening with lead. It's super scary, right? So there's lots of things that are like that. But we don't test our water for all of them. Okay. So that's all the slides I made when I remembered what we were talking about today. Questions or comments or things you want me to talk about more?
So one of my questions, and you mentioned it a little bit, but if we use the water, the land for different purposes, so like here on the Eastern Shore, we do a lot of agriculture, but there are other places where they mine, so what are the differences in the kinds of things we find in the water based on land use?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. One is the water chemistry can change how compounds are leached out of the surrounding rock, or can get into those areas. So depending on the pH and other things, right? But it also can transform compounds into more accessible, biologically accessible versions or species. So I'm thinking specifically about something like mercury. There are a lot of aquifers in the western US that are contaminated with mercury because of mining and other operations that happen there. Right? And so then the fish and everything in those ponds are high mercury contamination. But next door to that, you might have a pond, for example, that does not, even though there could be a lot of mercury in it, it's not accessible, it's not available, you're not seeing it in the fish. Because the chemistry is different, so the bacteria that are fixing that and helping to like put the organic compound piece on it, the methyl, to make it methyl mercury so that it's more accessible and it can work its way up the food web, that just doesn't happen in that particular one because of the chemistry. So yes, land use will impact what's potentially going in, and then the chemistry of the water, the geology of all of the stuff around it will impact how much of that's getting in, how much of it is, and then how much of it is accessible to anything along the food web. It's a great question. Yeah. So here I tried to concentrate on like the things that I know we're thinking about. But yeah, there's lots of other stuff, radiation, sort of weird things. Mm-hmm. Yes?
I was curious about when you were talking about the research that went unpublished, that, it's surprising enough to me anyway. I have family that, with half my immediate family, most of my extended family all works for the government. I know that there's, concerns over what you can say in certain positions, certainly. But, aside from not publishing it, I guess do you think there's it sounds like an X-Files question, but like, do you think there's a substantial enough amount of research that goes unpublished due to problems like that? Is there certain info that's not being released because of bureaucracy or worse?
Yes, there's actually a lot. So my toxicology class in the fall, Biology 425, if anybody's available here in the fall, feel free to take it. We do a book club as part, like one of the capstone presentation activities that the class does. And so we divide up into small groups. Everyone reads a different book. So we read things like Body Toxic, which is one woman's personal journey with exposures in the Toms River area of New Jersey. So lots and lots of very different exposures. And it's a hard read because she has some mental illness in addition to a bazillion different kinds of cancer. So it's amazing. It's a really heart-wrenching story, and it's really well written, but it's hard for particular science students to read. So we have that. And then one of the books that I have some group of students read is about the EPA, and it's from the perspective of someone who is now retired from the EPA, and he tells the story of all of the shenanigans that has gone on behind the scenes, where there has been like the thumb put down to stop various research from getting out there, redirected the scientists. I can't unfortunately remember the name of the book, but email me and I'll give it to you. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it is, in this country in particular, it is a little bit distressing how the political climate can impact how certain government agencies are working, and so then therefore inform the science of the folks who are working there and the folks who are getting grants from there, right? Because if the weather changes, one day it's, oh yeah, we want to study arsenic, we want to study mercury, nope, now we're going to study this other thing. And who knows why they changed it. And many different reasons. It could be because vaping is really dangerous and we don't know anything about what's in the vaping things, and so we've got to get a handle on that because we have so many young folks who are vaping, right? And so then you redirect the money. But it could also be because there was somebody behind the scenes who was like, I don't like that. I don't like what you're saying. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Didn't we have an example of that here in this county where the county health department, or I guess state-managed county health department, removed data that had previously been public, and Dr. Lewis's class had to do a lot of digging for that, right?
Yeah, that's right. A lot of this article about Morris Mill community, a lot of information used to be publicly available in the Wicomico County Health Department, and it is no longer available. Students could not get access to it. I could not get access to it. They said that you had to be a property owner in an affected area to get access to the data.
So one of the projects we used to do in toxicology was we would go onto a national website that was hosted at the EPA, and we could get access to searching by zip code to find what releases there were. Air, water, right, all the different potential sources. And so I would have the students look in your favorite zip code, right? So I'm a senior and I want to move to LA, and so what's over there? Or I love vacationing in this place and I want to look at what's there in that county, depending on how much data there was. In 2016, miraculously, that database disappeared. It took us a really long time to find it again, and I got so frustrated because we couldn't link to the data that were publicly available up until that point. I hear it's back, but yeah. Uh-huh.
See, you didn't talk much, but I think it's worth extending the conversation into not just what's in the water, but it has to go through pipes, whether it's the well pipe or the municipal pipes, and then into the houses, which all have their pipes, and a great deal of the toxicity in water often is coming from the journey, not the water. The pipe systems are understudied.
Yes, and the Flint water crisis is the perfect example of how what's carrying the water is really the problem rather than the water itself. Although the switch in the water source in that instance is what caused all of the problems, because all of a sudden the chemistry was different, and now the new water supply could leach out all of these bad things from the pipes, right? So certainly that is an issue. So do you have an old home? Do you have lead soldering? Do you have, like, right? All of those things are things to consider in terms of your exposure as well. And so of the different filtration systems, there are some that are at the point source, right? So I have a filter that's in my refrigerator that I can replace as soon as the thingy changes colors, so that the water that I'm getting out to drink with is filtered in some way, right? There's other ones that you can get, like the pure water filters for the pitchers or for your spigot on your. But I will say I have that filtration system in the drinking water in my refrigerator, but I don't on my kitchen tap, and that's where I'm getting the water that I'm cooking with. And I'm not getting rid of all the water in my pasta, right? Just eat some for dinner tonight. So there, you can bring it's not just drinking water. TCE is an interesting one because it's a volatile chemical, and so if it's in the water that's coming into your house and you're showering in an enclosed space with nice warm water, guess what happens to that volatile compound? You're breathing that sucker in, right? It's all around you, not just swimming in it. It's like you're existing in it. Yeah, so there's lots of things like that. So yes, absolutely, it's not just the groundwater contamination that we should be concerned about. We should know like all of the process. How is it getting to, which is why it's important to know, are you on a private well or city water? And really read that report if you're on city water. What's in there? What's happening? Yes?
So the equity issues are really important, but I think for many people, before they can wrap their head around equity issues, they freak out about their own water consumption. So what would you advise for people if they're in a city, or if they're on a well, or if they're using bottled water? Like, what are the things they should do to be safe themselves before they turn their attention to the larger system?
Oh, so let's make selfish decisions first. Okay. How do I protect me? So I think as you are able, so first, know your water source, right? So you should know if you're on a municipal water system, and then you should know if you are, so decision tree drawing in your mind, right? If you're on city water, how old is the piping that connects your house to that source and that's inside your house? And are you able to add additional filters if you can afford that? That's probably not a bad idea, just because like I said, you're only getting that report once a year. So if there's something that's happening. So I will say I keep that filter in my fridge, and that's the only water that I drink from my house. I don't drink, I mean, I brush my teeth with tap water, but I don't tend to, right? Drink straight out of the sink. If you're on a private well, you should be testing your water. You should send it out for testing. And as many analytes as you are able to, but for sure bacteria, like so various pathogens. So you need to know if your septic system, for example, is impacting the well, it's coming in through the sides, right, into your well. And then things like nitrates and other organic compounds. Yeah?
How do you start that testing?
So the Wicomico County Health Department actually has a form on their webpage. It takes, like, you got to go through a couple of drop-down menus, but start there. And then you can send it out for testing, or you can get testing kits. Amazon has a few. They're not fantastic, and they won't do all of the things that you want, but at least gives you something. Once you are informed about what's in your water, then you can make some decisions about what kind of water treatment system might you need, and where along those various price points is the one that's going to help you best. And if it's like way beyond your potential, then you can think about those point of source ones as a potential. Yes?
I'm not sure if you know the answer to this, but if you're looking to buy a home that is on a well water system, and you want the water tested before you move in, is the homeowner obligated to pay for the testing, or is that something that you need to do?
My understanding is that you have to do it. I mean, you might be able to negotiate it, but try and figure out how to work it into the closing or something, but it's on you. Which means that if you don't end up buying it, you put out that money, right? But it's part of the inspection.
And realtors they're not obligated to tell you anything about that. So in this county or in the lower shore, as far as I'm aware, realtors as a rule will not tell you you should test the water.
Right, that's absolutely true.
Because then you won't buy the house.
Right. Potentially, yeah, if it's an old well. But those are all questions you should ask. So you could ask about the age. You can look it up too. But I would look into the age of the well that you have. At a certain point, we shifted to sort of smarter well construction. So it's a little bit less likely to have some of the problems that older wells would have. You should be monitoring the integrity of the well cap, so you just have some idea of what's going on, and then testing. Yeah.
I think it also depends on what kind of funding you're looking for, because I had to have my well tested in order to qualify for the kind of loan I got for it. So checking it out too.
Oh yeah. Okay.
It is worth noting in terms of equity, several states, but not all states, do have funds that you can apply for as a rural citizen in order for the states to pick up the tab for testing well water, especially if you are in a zone that the state is interested in collecting data for. So they will come out and test your water because they want to know something else anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so the paper that it's like a really short newspaper article basically that I sent out. Did you send that to them? So that talks about a county health official who is interested in testing the water in this area, and so like trying to get folks to get on board with that. And she's found ways to get money to be able to do that for folks rather than making them pay for it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Who sets the toxicity levels to say that they're bad for humans?
The toxicologists.
How do they formulate that?
Oh my goodness, I'm so glad you asked that question. So how do we know that something that we're testing in cell culture, so individual cells in a dish, or small animals, mice or rats, and the outcomes that we're seeing there means that it's going to have an adverse effect in a person? Really complicated math. So there's folks who spend a lot of time trying to figure out how possible it is to take those scientific studies that are done in those models and then upscale it into something that's meaningful for whether it's animals, various animals and ecosystems, or it's humans. And it involves figuring out, like, what do we know about the difference in how my cells and produce particular enzymes that are proteins that are able to process that exposure into something that's toxic, more toxic, less toxic, right? Compared to the mouse that it was studied in, right? So in my toxicology class, we talk a lot about cytochrome P450s. It's a class, a very broad class of proteins that are really good at taking a target and putting, I call it the hitch. It's like a hydroxyl group, an OH, onto, or various other kinds of hitches onto these compounds, whatever the toxic compound is or potentially toxic compound is. But that enzyme has a specificity for a particular shape of target that it's going to put that hitch on. So if the mice don't make one version of that enzyme and I make a different version, those two different versions might act very, very differently and be able to put that hitch on in very different percentages. That hitch is critical for adding on a bigger thing that makes that toxin or that compound, that xenobiotic, very water soluble, which means you can get rid of it easier. So phase 1 and phase 2 biotransformation reactions. Right? So it's really just about what do we know about the differences or similarities between the systems we're trying to compare. And the point of all of that is that we can do toxicology studies in small animals. We can do it in zebrafish. We can do it in frogs. We can do it in cells. Nobody's going to sign up for a study where I'm like, can you volunteer for me to stab you with this thing and give you this whole dose of stuff, right? So those epidemiologic studies, the free-range human things, it's like I'm trying to gather information about people that are out there as much as I can, but I don't know for sure, right? I didn't dose them with that thing, and we're all living in this very complex soup with all kinds of other exposures, right? And I don't know how those interact. Hardly anybody's doing those studies where we're looking at mixtures of exposures and then the adverse outcomes, right? So the science is difficult to do. There's a lot of very well-meaning scientists who are doing lots of really cool things, and the math is kind of hard. So yeah, we do the best we can. And then we wait and see what kinds of, like, what things show up over time. So it's really hard to make those predictions. Yeah.
That's how the toxicologist makes recommendations. Can you just talk about the next step?
Yeah, so it all sits, so the fantastic thing about toxicologists, and this is why what I talk about in my class, is that they're able to sit at this in between a bunch of different stakeholders. So the person who is concerned about an exposure can ask for some studies to be done, or the governmental agency can say, I'm hearing that there's some exposures, and so can we do some studies? But then they can also make recommendations back to both of those groups to say, avoid this. Like, if you're pregnant, don't eat a whole lot of fish because you could be exposed to mercury and that could impact your child, your developing fetus, right? Or over to the government, public health-wise, it would be better if we set regulations so that people are not going to be exposed. Obviously, on that side, now you're talking about what's Hopkins School of Public Health. I think it's like public health, saving lives, millions at a time. They're not one at a time in it like doctors are, right? So we set policy to try to help the majority of folks. The problem with that, though, is that most of those policy decisions are based on the majority of folks, right? So it's hard to get changes if you're only talking about a very small, vulnerable percentage of the population, as opposed to everybody's going to die if we have this thing happen, right? We're easily going to get that approved. So there's some wiggling that has to happen and negotiation that has to happen as we're trying to navigate the space to help people as much as we can, help ecosystems as much as we can, but also we have to eat, so we need to be able to grow crops. So sometimes we have to fertilize those crops, and so then there's that relationship that also has to happen. So that was a big conversation here when folks were talking about protecting the paleo channel and nitrates getting into there. Like, we can't just get rid of the chicken operation on the Eastern Shore. Like, the economic impact of that would be devastating. But what could we do? Maybe something more like what Denmark does, which is very different in how they treat their houses, how they just like get rid of the waste, and the incidences of various adverse health outcomes are very different between those two countries. Now, that's a very different kind of country than the United States, but the differences are there, right? So yeah, it's a fun place to be that toxicologist sitting in the middle. Yes?
I had a quick question
Okay.
just about maybe some relativity factors. I was just thinking, as we watch kind of America's average age, dip very far, and other countries seem to be doing better than us in many, many, many ways. But, and I know that's probably too big a question, really, especially knowing that, food and lifestyles, of course, many, many important aspects. But, based on water quality and concerns about, rising cancer rates and multitudes of individuals, different areas and backgrounds. Do you think water and how we consume and the culture around it here in the States, is there research leading to that, that would see if there's a decline in the average age?
So, longevity of the population correlated to water quality. I can't think of any studies offhand. I know that the World Health Organization has done targeted studies looking at specific things. So for example, I was involved in one that was looking at mercury and childhood exposures. And so we had folks from all over the world bringing in their data and trying to write this book, basically to talk about that. So I know that there are some resources like that, but they tend to be focused on the particular exposure thing. So arsenic or mercury or TCE or PFAS or whatever, BPA, whatever it is, rather than just in general like an overall measure index of water quality. Now I did see one paper, mid-2000 teens-ish, that was talking about trying to come up with a water quality index so that we would have some way to correlate land use and then various exposures from groundwater with potential adverse health impacts. But it was like in one relatively small area of one country that's not the United States. And I don't remember seeing more than that, but they might be out there. Be something to look at for sure. Honors thesis, anyone?
Well, can I respond to that question a little bit?
Yeah.
So I'm a sociologist, and one of the things that I do is study demography and population. And so when we're talking about the decline in life expectancy in the United States over the past several years, most of that is directly attributable to higher levels of economic inequality. And economic inequality is associated with a whole bunch of things that create hardship if you live at the poverty level. So whether that's water, whether that's lead in the building that you're growing up in, whether that's loss of job, what all of those kinds of things. So we do have, and they've done some really interesting studies on this, pockets of areas where poverty, low income is prevalent, access to hospitals, doctors, et cetera, is limited, and life expectancy for people who are in those neighborhoods is 10 years younger than average. Yeah, or more.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Culmination.
Yeah, so it's all of those things?
Yeah.
Anything else? Yeah?
Could you talk a little bit about that super weird BPA thing, about how the low dose is worse than a high dose? Does that mean that you're just better off getting a lot of it?
No, it's that there's unfortunately, no. There's a middle range that's okay, but the adverse effects at the high dose it's bad and it's one thing, and then at the low dose, it's long-term, probably modifications to gene expression, so epigenetic changes that, and then reproductive, gestational sort of like, so reproductive outcomes and some sex determinant outcomes are impacted at the low dose. So things like studies in alligators where we see weird differences in, or similar to the atrazine studies where like Tyrone Hayes has looked at impacts to frogs, right? The feminization of frogs at really low doses that you wouldn't predict based on what we know about how that functions at higher doses, right? Bad things happen up here, but very different things. They're not killing the frogs, it's just making them not do what they're supposed to do, or as you would predict. Male frogs are laying eggs. Yeah.
So you touched on bottled water a little bit, but so where does water bottle come from? And are there any testing regulations that those companies have to follow? You know, you're talking about testing once a year, or sending out reports. Do bottled water companies have to do any of that?
It's like the difference between your medications that you buy in the pharmacy and the things that you buy over the counter. There are two different regulatory bodies that govern those things, right? And so not all bottled water is coming from the same source, and like it's spring bottled water, or it's from this particular part of the Adirondacks, or whatever it is, right? And it'll list some of the things that they know are in there, but no, it's like more unregulated than you would like it to be. So it's not just straight up H2O. Yes.
I've heard a bit about like the bottles itself, like they will see chemicals into the water no longer than like the water is in the bottle.
Yeah.
So like if you have a water bottle, you should drink it faster than
Well, but also how long has that water been sitting at that bottle before you got to it? And how was it treated, right? Yeah, so the thing with plastic water bottles in particular is that the way that the chemical industry makes those plastic bottles, there's a compound that they need to help it to solidify and to like make that matrix so that it's like the shape that you want it to be and sits the way it is. And unfortunately, those compounds aren't like hard covalently bound into that matrix. Frequently, they're just like sort of attached, right? And so over time, they can just kind of leach out. There were some studies done where we were trying to figure out, is it like, well, if you freeze the water bottles or if you have them at really, like you microwave the thing, right? Mixed results. So it got a lot of press and folks were saying, don't freeze your water bottles or don't leave them in your car. But stuff is still leaching out regardless. It just is slightly different timelines. So the hard, like Nalgene bottles, are better than the softer plastic ones. The chemistry of how they make them is a little bit different. But a metal, like stainless steel bottle is better, or glass-lined one is better. They have different properties. Things can still attach to them, adhere, leach off, depending on the stuff that you've got in there, but it's generally better. The exposure is less. Mm-hmm.
We've got a lot of buildings at SU that were built in the 1950s or so, like some of the dormitories, Devil this Hall. Has anybody done testing of the water that's coming through the piping into those buildings that you're aware of?
Not that I'm aware of.
Me neither.
But
It's probably fine.
I'm sure it's perfect. So, so one of the things I do for creek watchers is we analyze that river water, and every now and then I might be able to throw in an extra sample. So if anyone has a really cool honors thesis, graduate, like a senior project, for example, and they're thinking about water and the dorms are here on SU campus, I would love to help with that project. That would be fun. So I will say, I mean, I don't drink the water from the sink here, but I do drink it from those water fill stations, and those have filters in them. So it's similar to the one that's in my fridge, right? And they do replace those.
Along those lines, can you talk about that for a little bit? You mentioned reverse osmosis earlier. When I bought the house that I just sold, we did put a reverse osmosis system in it, but it was just for the drinking water. I did use it in my coffee maker because it also filtered my coffee maker and kept my coffee maker running for a very long time. But same thing, didn't necessarily hard boil eggs in the filtered water, didn't make my spaghetti in the filtered water. So what are any filtration system is good, better than nothing? Are there ones that are a lot better?
So it depends on what it is that you're trying to remove. There are some that are better than others for certain things, right? So all of the ones that you can buy in the store, the different pitcher-based ones, will tell you what sort of, it can get to this level with these different compounds, but it's not worrying about these other things. Usually they're all able to filter out bacteria, which is huge for a public health exposure, right? But lead or nitrates or things like that, you have to really be careful about what the filter is made of, and then you need to replace it, right? So I will admit that in the little fountain that I got for my cats, there's a filter on the top and there's a filter on the bottom, and I change the filter on the top when it starts getting yucky, but I'm terrible about remembering to change the one on the bottom because it's underneath all the stuff. But they're doing two different things, right? So whatever it is that filter on the bottom is filtering out, it's probably not doing it anymore. Sorry to my cats, little gatito's in big trouble. But the one on the top I do change, right? So you should, at the recommended timing, change it. So and it's the same thing with the house filtration systems, water treatment systems, all of those. You want to know what the manufacturer recommended lifetime is, and periodically test just to make sure that it's doing what you think it's doing. And if you know that there's something bad in your well water, you might want to consider putting that filtration system at the house level before it comes in, as opposed to at the source, like with mine in the fridge or at the sink or the pitcher, right? Because you might, depending on what's in that water, you might want to reduce exposure in the shower, for example, or with what you're cooking. Mm-hmm.
Could we go back to the map with the red dots and
then the yellow dots? Mm-hmm.
the nitrate test for the county? What struck me about that is that they all seem to be clustered in our more urban areas, right?
Mm-hmm.
Salisbury, Fruitland, maybe Del Mar up there. And do we know whether that's because that's where the testing tends to occur? And they just don't test the rest of the county, which is more heavily agricultural? See, yeah, it doesn't correspond to this.
Right.
That's what was.
So this is the network that they have, and I think
I believe in each of the zones.
there's multiple, yeah.
Wells that are monitored.
Right.
And the easiest way to put a monitoring well in is usually on public property, and those dots that you're looking at are owned by the county. And so most of it is patches within the urban fabric. Like the county owns this lot here and that strip
Mhm.
there. And so wherever you can
But,
put in
yeah.
a well that you can access, but you don't have to ask permission of a landowner, is likely where those dots are.
Mhm. Yep.
I was wondering whether that was reflective of some equity issues also, right? Because the way our zoning works is that we have the heavy industrial areas sited at the boundaries of the city.
It's hard to know from this map. I was
Yeah.
wondering that as well.
Mhm. Yeah. And I was trying to find like more zoomed in or other layers, and it's very confusing for me. That's not what I do, right?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Do we have any other questions?
Thank you all so much for coming. I really
Thank you very
appreciate it.
much.
We're going to have more water stuff coming up soon.